Thank you for coming. I am Magda Tedder. I'm the Spidler Chair in Judaic Studies. And I'm really happy to see actually so many of you on Sunday afternoon and to come to learn about the Index of Prohibited Books and censorship of books in history of censorship and of books and also of censorship of books at Fordham. So the exhibit started a few years ago. The idea came out a few years ago before the current recent book bans. And that's because we have a collection of Jewish books that had been censored from the 16th and 17th century. So we were thinking of creating an exhibit that would tell a longer story of censorship, and then the news caught up with us. But before the development of the printing press, in the middle of the 15th century, ideas were transmitted orally through tales, songs, and poems, or in writing painstakingly copied by hand, and we'll see some examples upstairs on the 4th floor. Some books fell out of use or were simply not reproduced. Those that were popular survived in many manuscripts, preserved in different versions across centuries and places. But neglecting to copy books or simply destroying them outright assured their loss. Passages from the Bible contain mentions of scrolls that had been lost or destroyed. For instance, the book of Joshua notes the book of Yashar, now lost. Jeremiah in chapter 36 gives an account of burning of a scroll that Jeremiah had dictated to Baruch the scribe. And the Christian New Testament recounts book burnings in Ephesus by new converts rejecting their earlier beliefs and ideas. And this is from the book of Acts. Also, many of those who are now believers came confessing and divulging their practices. And a number of those who had practiced magic arts brought their books together and burned them in sight of all. And they counted the value of them and found some 50,000, and it came to some 50,000 pieces of silver. So valuable. The Talmud cites the 3rd century Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish casually mentioning book burning. There are many verses in the Torah that seemingly fit to be burned as books of the heretics, since they appear redundant or frivolous, and yet they are themselves the essence of the Torah. Books then could be destroyed by accident, neglect, falling out of use, or censorship. Censorship is about power, the power of ideas and the power to ban them. Ideas and books are banned when they are deemed threatening. So it is also about vulnerability. Recent bans of books across the United States targeting Black history, the Holocaust, LGBTQ-themed books have dominated the news. We began working on this exhibit, as I mentioned, 2 years ago. We wanted to, as I said, we wanted to weave the story of censorship of Jewish books into the larger story of books bans and book censorship. In fact, some of the earliest examples of wholesale book burnings and censorship comes from Christian Europe, the burning of Jewish books, with the burning of the Talmud along with carts of other Jewish books in Paris in 1242, perhaps the most prominent. This exhibit then explores the long history and practices of censorship, the methods to control and ban books and ideas, but also the resilience of censored works and the attempts to push back. Authorities could ban books, but they could not destroy them or their ideas entirely. As the Talmud states, the parchment is burning, but its letters are flying to the heavens. As the exhibit demonstrates, cultural, religious, and moral values are never static. They change over time. If some of the books and ideas become acceptable, others might become abhorrent. Indeed, today, some of the voices are heard complaining about universities not teaching the major texts of Western civilization. We show in our exhibit that many of the books considered to be the core of the big book courses were originally banned across Europe by both Protestant and Catholic authorities. Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, David Hume, Denis Diderot, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Stuart Mill, Immanuel Kant, and more, as we'll see. Major works of literature, too, cherished today, were also banned, among them Victor Hugo, Les Miserables, Andrea Dumas, Three Musketeers, and more. As we explore the history of book banning and censorship, we also ask viewers tough questions. Should all books and ideas be freely accessible? Are there and should be limits of censorship? This exhibit was co-curated with a Fordham undergraduate student, Hanora Ragusa, who is not here with us. Also, Gabriela Di Bellio, who is a librarian at the Special Collections and Archives, and Annie Levine Kennedy, who is a professor in the communications department and also a curator of a gallery, Judaica Gallery in the JCC in Mamaroneck. We are especially grateful to Linda Lo Schiavo, the director of Fordham Libraries, Vivian Shen at the O'Hare Special Collections, who always sets up exhibits with great care and attention to details. Additional research had been provided by several undergraduate students, Samantha Scalfani and Kevin Bokutsky, both have now graduated. And the lecture series associated with the exhibits and the student research have been made possible through the generosity of so many of you, friends of the Center for Jewish Studies at Fordham. Now, let me introduce our speaker, and I'm going to switch for us to see her. Hopefully she's here with us. Andreea Badea, who is joining us from Frankfurt today, is a scholar of pre-modern history of knowledge and historiography, as well as the history of book censorship and Roman institutional history at the Goethe University in Frankfurt. She has worked on the history of the Index of Prohibited Books and is currently writing a book on truth claims and cognitive authority in the attitudes of Roman curia towards the emerging disciplines of church history in the long 17th century. She is the author and editor of many books, most recently Making Truth in Early Modern Catholicism and Pathways to Early Modern Christianity, which the last one came out this year. So Andreea, well, I want to say the floor, but really the screen is yours. And okay. Oh,
can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Thank you so much for this invitation. And I'm so sorry to join you only via Zoom, but I'm still so grateful for this technology because like this, at least we can talk to each other at least through space. I'll share my screen. Can you see the screen?
Yes, sorry, I was muted, so yes, we can see.
Okay.
Perfect.
Then I'll start my paper. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for inviting me today. And I'm so happy to talk to you today about the Roman Congregation of the Index and Early Modern Practices of Censoring. And however, every time one speaks about the Congregation of the Index, we should always talk also about the Inquisition, about the Roman Inquisition. So my paper will touch the Congregation of the Index, the Inquisition, and the practices of censoring regarding authors and readers. Okay. Censorship is part of central discourses in our society. Today, it is the correlative counterpart to freedom of expression. In democratic, free societies, it always describes a condition that must be overcome socially, politically, and educationally. However, censorship has also become a term inflationary used to discredit disagreeable opponents or express inhuman opinions. And it will not delve into these topics. I will not delve into this topic as it is too different from early modern notions of censorship. Before censorship turned into an antonym of freedom of expression during the 18th century, so during the Enlightenment, it was a medium to isolate and liquidate false and dangerous knowledge in pre-modern times. At least in the ecclesiastical sphere, censorship was supposed to protect against heresy and provide salvation. And this is very important. It was not considered as a tool of suppression. It was a tool of salvation. Because every time people talked about reading as a sin, it was also a question, what happens to the soul after dying? So I would therefore like to start with a passage from the already mentioned Acts of the Apostles quoted over centuries. And I will focus exclusively on Catholic ecclesiastical censorship and the censorship practiced in Rome and by Rome. This means by the Roman Inquisition, founded in 1542, and the Index congregation, which has backed it up since 1571. Both institutions claimed, like the papacy as a whole, universal authority, and we know very well that this was not true. So I come to Acts 19:19, and a number of those who had faith came and made a public statement of their sins and all their acts, and a great number of those who were experts in strange arts, this means in sorcery, took their books and put them on the fire in front of everyone. As a result, the idea of a misguided who, bending the word of God, returned to the path of true faith and the pure word, persisted for a long time. During the Age of Enlightenment, the curia in Rome even managed to use this image of knowledge control to cover two fields of a constantly pluralizing society simultaneously, the production and the reception of knowledge. And here we are at the first core of the freedom of opinion and the freedom of thought mentioned in the beginning. So what we see here in the frontispiece of the Index of Forbidden Books issued in 1758 by the Reformist Pope Benedict XIV. According to Catholic perception, the conviction of the purity of faith overlaps with a belief in reason practiced in competing cultures, like the Enlightenment erudites, for example, and the Catholic Church. In the end, it is insightful, reasonable author who voluntarily destroyed dangerous knowledge. Be that as it may, neither Apostles 1919 nor Benedict's Utopia requires a commander to give direction. The character of book burning, so of book banning, as an act of free and self-made decision based on gained insight does not change. And this is a central point in the ecclesiastical discursive defense of censorship as a tool of salvation for centuries. Yet, there was a development between Acts 1919 and the 18th century. And this is what I want to talk about in the next 30 minutes. I will follow two main threads in the history of censorship. The author, sorry, just a moment. And so the author and his changing position in relation to book censorship over the course of time, and the readers who were increasingly the focus of ecclesiastical authorities. So I come to my first point, the author. I will discuss the relationship between the authors, their works, and their own salvation or physical safety at least, and the role of censorship from late antiquity to the 18th century. I will show that as printing became more common, the bond between author, book, and punishment increasingly loosened. And second, as far as the reader is concerned, I would like to pick up where I previously described the relationship between the author, the censorship authorities, and his book. After all, the believer as a reader first came to the attention of the censors through the printing press and increasing literacy. So before, let's say in the Middle Ages, the simple readers were not in the focus of censorship. Censorship was an erudite practice which concerned only erudites, and it didn't touch the reading practice in the first. But here too, however, in regarding reading practices, we see that as the censorship apparatus became progressively more formalized, the forms and the intensity of control also changed through time. I'm coming to my first point, to the author and the Roman censorship. The voluntary nature of the act of burning and its thus conversion in Apostles 19:19 was never questioned. It was always part of the Christian narrative. However, another point is considered here that is elementary for all manifestations of Christianity. That is the absolute truth of one's position, in our case, the Roman Church, which does not allow any alternatives or variations and must thus inevitably persuade. We see it here, for example, with Saint Dominic. Book burning can also apply to the positive list, but it does not work. Truth does not burn. You see it in this book, which flew away from the stake. So the ideal is that the content speaks for itself, and that true content, true knowledge, true faith doesn't burn. Only the negative one burns and is so predicted to be banned. Book bans and book burnings have been known since Constantine, for example, against the teaching of Arius, Origen, or the Manichaeans, whose books were burned by Pope Leo I in 446. In this context, censorship was always equated with fire, which simultaneously ensured order in truth with its destructive and purifying power. Beyond the measures taken against authors of dangerous knowledge, scholars were always allowed to read forbidden books, to form their own opinion, and as a consequence, to be able to refute them. And this is until the 19th century, scholars are always allowed to read books if they are asked for licenses. And licenses are given to lawyers, to people who are into medicine and questions regarding the medicine, and theologians, and of course for people belonging to the noble sphere of the society. This implies that it was rarely planned to completely destroy texts. This means knowledge, even if classified as false and heretical. So the Roman Church never tried to completely erase a book and its knowledge, because they needed it. They needed it. They needed the proof copies, which they put back as in order to completely refute the false or heretical content later. And this is spoken beyond questions of damnatio memoria. Of course, we have cases in which they completely tried to forget an author's name and his works, but usually they had them in a library. So this entanglement between author and work, the manifestation of his thoughts, was thus constantly reaffirmed by the stake ex negativo. And a slow change of these questions occurred in 1487 with the bull Inter Multiplices issued by Innocent VIII. On the one hand, this was a fundamental break in the development of book printing, because Innocent had decreed that books without an imprimatur, that is, without a printing license, were forbidden per se. However, I am interested in the other side, namely what happened to these banned books when they were identified as such. It is essential for the history of institutions and the debates on the centralization of censorship within the Roman Church that Innocent had given the bishops the power of disposal over possible punishment measures. Accordingly, their task was to confiscate such books and discard them by fire. At the same time, however, it is noteworthy that the stake became an administrative instrument with this decree. Alongside the large stage stakes of the 16th and 17th and very early 17th century, as we know them from Rome or London and Geneva, where authors and works were publicly destroyed, there were now more and more of these unspectacular stakes in country yards and backyards, in courtyards, and backyards, which were dedicated only to the books and did not harm the author anymore, because censorship focused more and more on the content and only in extraordinary political cases on the author. So these new stakes were attended only by the executioner who had erected them and supervised their burning. In the Holy Office in Rome, this practice remained until the invasion of the French troops in the inner courtyard of the Inquisition Palace. So it's the very place where we have today this beautiful fountain teeming with fish and turtles, where the headsman of the first and most important Roman congregation executed the batches of confiscated books periodically for more than 300 years. And this is not only about the books of the Inquisition, but also the books confiscated by order of the Congregation of the Index. And it's a very, let's say, unspectacular way of destroying the books. However, the Inquisition always kept, and the Congregation of the Index always kept at least one voucher copy for its working library. They kept the library in the rooms of the Holy Inquisition until 1701, after which they stored them in the Biblioteca Casanatense, a donation of the Cardinal Inquisitor and Prefect of the Congregation of the Index, Girolamo Casanate. These books are, so all the books you see in this picture are, so to speak, the haptic counterpart of the Biblioteca Vulcano Consacrata evoked by Martin Mulsow's Precarious Knowledge. So a Catholic collection of shame, a place of negative memoria. At the same time, however, the same works of the Biblioteca Vulcani were also the subject of utopian rescue projects of precarious knowledge throughout the early modern period. And just as almost every non-Catholic library of early modern Europe with self-esteem filled up its collections with the Index of Forbidden Books in hand, there were also efforts to put such libraries on paper, even if the moral considerations behind them were, let's say, very controversial. So probably this is why the first successful realization of such a project came in 1802 with Gabriel Penot's Dictionnaire critique littéraire et bibliographique des livres condamnés au feu, supprimés ou censurés. Along with the increasing functionalization of the stake as part of the Roman administration, we also note a certain softening of the bond between author and work in the perception of the Roman censors of the Congregation of the Index and the Inquisition. We know that especially when it was not a matter of knowledge content that had been declared heretical, but only if it was thoughtless, temeraria, false, erronea, unworthy of pious ears, bis auribus offensiva or scandalosa. Since the second half of the 17th century, authors of such books were no longer directly persecuted. Sometimes they lost maybe their offices if they were members of ecclesiastical institutions. Sometimes they only endangered their career, which would now be of little surprise. And in most of these cases, they endangered their career only for the life of another pope, and afterwards they continued their careers even with one or two prohibited books on their list. This certainly has a lot to do with the fact that the Index of Forbidden Books focused primarily on Catholic authors quickly after its final version under Clement VIII in 1596. Thus, it became a rule book not only for Catholic readers, but also about Catholic authors. Introducing the index in Catholic territories was sometimes difficult enough, as it always required the permission of the territorial sovereign. So in France, there were always problems to introduce the index, and Bavaria only accepted parts of it when it didn't endanger the own authors. And Spain, for example, had, however, its own index. So this idea of an universal Roman index librorum prohibitorum is quite an utopic one. In any case, non-Catholic authors found their ways, Magda already mentioned the important names of the Enlightenment and of the 19th century. They found their names on the index only sporadically over the next 200 years after the foundation of the index. It was more or less, let's say they came on the index the moment their works were translated or found in Italy. But in most of the cases, they only reached the index years after the authors died, for example. This does not mean that their books were not banned for Catholic readers. However, actually most of the reading practices were regulated by the 10 index rules that had existed since the Council of Trent. The rules concerned first all books banned by popes and ecumenical councils to the same extent before 1515. All new heretics and heresiarchs since 1515, this means Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, Schwenkfeld, and other like them. Works by other heretics are only banned if they deal explicitly with religious topics. Other works would first have to be subjected to an examination. Thirdly, editions of the Church Fathers in Latin Bible translations, which heresiarchs had published. The Bible in vulgar languages. This means that no Catholic was allowed to read any Bible passages in its own language until the Second Vaticano. Reference works published by Protestants, and this includes also dictionaries and encyclopedic works. Controversial theology in vernacular languages. Controversial theology was only allowed in contact zones, so in Germany, in Switzerland, in some parts of France, but Italian authors, for example, were not allowed to read controversial works because they were not expected to answer to them. Of course, obscene books, they were prohibited, like obscene books or pornographic books all over Europe. And all books of divination, magic, and astrology. The 8th index rule referred to the exceptions. So books could also be exempted if they had previously been expurgated or purified by the Inquisition or by the Index congregation. They planned to examine, actually in the beginning, before, in the first years after 1571, the Index congregation expected to be able to expurgate all the books published until then. And to create a kind of preventive censorship. So this would have meant that they didn't need any post-print censorship, but of course they understood within a few years that this plan was not possible. It was possible for Spain and for the Spanish index, but not for the Roman index, because they didn't have the manpower and they didn't have the possibility to cover the book market as on the same level like the Spaniards did, because the Spaniards did it only for Spain, and the Roman Inquisition had to do it for the whole world because they claimed to be universal. So the Roman censorship authorities of the Index congregation and the Inquisition mainly focused on inner Catholic order, because the non-Catholic order was already covered by these 10 index rules. What happened was that they targeted authors from their own lines, and so sometimes the book of an important member of the curia was banned. In other cases, high prelates were subjected to long inquisition trials. This happened, for example, to Enrico Nores. However, they usually tried to resolve such cases quietly to avoid drawing too much attention to the fact that there was no actual agreement, even within the center of the power. One case in which manifest dissent was urgently avoided, reducing the separation of author and his work to absurdity, is that of the Jesuit Giovanni Battista Faure. Faure had been professor of philosophy and theology at the Collegio Romano since 1728, and he was a very loud and eloquent enemy of Jansenism and also of the Dominicans. The Dominicans, the most important order within the Inquisition and the congregation of the Index, were probably the main enemy with whom the Jesuits had to fight the most battles since the founding of the Society of Jesus. Faure wrote his critique against the Dominicans and the Inquisition and the congregation of the Index in this anonymously published booklet called Commentarium in Bullam Pauli Terzi licet ab initio. Paul III reinstalled the Inquisition with this bull in 1542, as I already mentioned. This book got into the hands of the Roman Inquisition, and they found it it was an unfortunate situation that they found these books, and as the commissarios of the Holy Office and the consultors all immediately knew very well who the author was, they demanded Faure to write an opinion of the book for the inquisitorial censorship procedure. So they required from Faure to act as a consultor of the Inquisition in order to ban his own book. However, it was his first and last assignment for the Inquisition, but he had to accept, and he prepared a written expertise for the proceedings. He condemned in the end his own writing in the strongest terms, and in his reply from 9th October 1756. And he, of course, pleaded for a ban because he underlined that this book has to be seen as a heretic one, and of course he didn't reveal himself as an author. But he had to stand the humiliation to appear in front of the Inquisition and read this text against himself. The consultors would have liked to burn the book in public and imprison Faure to get their hands on the accomplices of the book branding. But however, such actions were no longer common, even in Rome, which is why the cardinals decided on 17 June 1757 that the book should simply be banned without creating any further publicity. It wasn't simply the time anymore to trial people in such a public way like they did 150 years ago. So this is why all the cardinals of the Inquisition acted as if they knew nothing about Faure's authorship. Faure continued to be a professor of the Collegio Romano, and nobody asked any questions anymore. I'm coming to my second point, to the reader as a believer and sinner, or to the believer as a reader and sinner. And this is the other part of censura. And I want to get to this other part of censura and look at those affected by censorship, the readers who generally knew what they were allowed to read and what not. Yet they had their reasons for wanting to read certain books. Bearing in mind that reading forbidden books was a sin, they also had to decide whether to confess and acknowledge it or keep it secret. In other words, commit another sin. This part of censorship is in a way harder to explore regarding the Roman curia. We are not talking about Venice, for example, and the vast research since Paul Grendler. And still, it is even harder to explore it than the active institutional side because of the destruction of all the Roman trial cases after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. However, we still have several summary sources on the readers of banned books who came before the Roman Inquisition as so-called sponte comparentes, as self-denouncers. Based on these sources, we can learn which knowledge or which books seem to so dangerous to the individual faithful that they preferred to denounce themselves before someone else did. We can also see how differently the Inquisition approached punishment depending on how it learned about the sin or crime committed. It was precisely this fine line between sin and crime that was one of the main inquisitorial tools in disciplining the faithful, as we learned from Vincenzo Lavegna. I will shortly introduce you in some of these cases, and there are cases of the early 17th century, because later they just become simple formalized proceedings. In 1624, the noble Francesco de Frias appeared in front of the Inquisition and denounced himself for owning some medical and sorcery recipes. The only thing he was required to do after confessing was to promise that he would never touch this kind of information again. And nothing else happened. In 1635, the young apprentice Giovanni Vincenzo di Valerna apparently denounced himself for having read sorcery books. He even pointed out some sorcerous practices. In return, he got permission to leave after an aburatio de levi. This means that he just had to do this aburatio in front of the inquisitors in a closed room without any public, and go home. This procedure may seem at first glance to derive from a rather open-minded approach to crossing established borders, but only if we ignore the fact that both the noble and the apprentice not only came to denounce themselves, but also those surrounding them. The documents don't tell us what happened to the mostly clerical entourage of the second man. I can only talk about one monk in the case of Francesco de Frias, and about at least 3 other clerics in the case of the young Vincenzo. But in another case, that of a 33 years old doctor from Agnani, which is a very small town close to Rome, we have some more information. Marco Ruccoli came in 1647 to Rome to denounce himself for having read Il Machiavelli. Maybe the Prince, maybe the Storia Fiorentina, but I think rather the Prince, because the Prince was more interesting for young men in that time, because they took it as a guideline for noble and diplomatic habit. However, in doing so, he immediately named the man who had given him the book with the instruction to burn it after reading. He also gave the name of a certain Ceccheroni, to whom he lent the Machiavelli after having read it. Although we don't find any trace of the typical declarations of sponte comparentia, like usually people just declare they have just read parts of the book without understanding them, and only for curiosity, because not remembering, not knowing, not understanding were major criteria for the redemption. They were like a ticket to get out of the Inquisition very quickly. And this is something Sponte Comparentes knew very well. Ruccoli, however, got discharged on the 24th of April, 1647, whereas the other 2 were prosecuted for the possession and reading of forbidden literature. In Ceccheroni's case, the Inquisition even required a house search. The volume of the Archive of the Dicastery of Faith in Rome does not conserve any notes on the procedure in the cases of denunciation regarding Machiavelli, but the fact that Ruccoli named other people could be understood as a clear indicator of the strong threat of force, which constrained every Sponte Comparens to name as many people as possible in order to save their own, let's say, rather body than soul from harm. One look at the denunciation is enough to understand this, because in these cases, it did not end with a simple aburatio de levi. They had to do an aburatio de vehementis, which always happened after the respondent was usually tortured into revealing more details, and afterwards he was often imprisoned for 5 years. One can find denunciations through the 1650s, and the accusation in the documented cases is mostly about heresy, because reading forbidden books was often considered a heretic practice. However, naming people, defining networks, seems to be an important aspect in the declaration of the Sponte Comparentes up to the 1650s. Afterwards, it stops. Later on, we can notice a certain decrease because almost none of the interrogated disclosed names of accomplices anymore. This could be understood as due to the reduction of the treat of force that had dominated the society just a few decades earlier. At least we can understand it in this way when we consider the circumstances under which they appeared in front of the Inquisition. During the 18th century, sinners came because of the fear of having been witnessed in the unauthorized reading. But even in these cases, they did not name people, preferring to remain somehow vague in talking about some monk, some man whose name they pretended not to remember, or even some person who had given them books or had seen them in some way with the corpus delicti. Most of the cases are denounced, most of the Sponte Comparentes of the 18th century just come because they are afraid of having been seen by somebody. And they are not afraid of their soul, they are not afraid of their confession situation. It's just about this fear of having been seen, and in the end getting off with a quick abjuratio de levi. I'm coming to my conclusion. Book printing had decisive consequences when it came to dealing with forbidden knowledge. Gone were the days when monks drew attention to heretical remarks in marginalia during the Middle Ages. At the same time, improved production and reproduction practices meant that authors were no longer so closely associated with their works. Punishments were no longer staged, and it was preferable to only punish books independently of their author. Instead, punishment remained an instrument of social discipline for the faithful. The index rules and practices of active control by the Inquisition were intended to turn them away from the path of sin or crime. But here too, as in the case of the authors, formalized strategies had already been used since the mid-17th century, which no longer required grand gestures and, more importantly, physical punishment of the sinner or criminal.